Thank you very much for the nice introduction and, of course, for the opportunity to speak here. Today, I'll be presenting General Store Speculative Address Translation in x86 processors, which is joined with Anirban and Yuval. And maybe before I start, I want to give a very quick recap of, I think, a topic nearly everybody here is familiar with, namely the Spectre attack. For this, I've just brought along a very simple gadget where we have a simple array bounds check, and then we have two arrays, array 1 and array 2. And if what we now do is, let's assume we have an index that's in bounds, and of course we bypass the bounds check, we retrieve a certain value dependent on this index from array 1, temp value, this gets cached in a CPU cache, and then we access array 2 based on this retrieved value, which also gets cached. And of course, it's noteworthy here that the index, the value of the array 2 that we now cache, depends on the value that we retrieve from array 1. Now what we can do is we can repeatedly invoke this gadget with the condition always evaluating to true, meaning that we're always inbound. And we do this a lot of times, or repeatedly continue to repeat this. What we're actually doing, we're going to be training the BPU, or the branch predictor unit. This means the branch predictor unit is a special hardware unit of CPUs that assists the CPU in predicting branches which it can't immediately resolve. And specifically, this means we have the following situation. Let's assume that we actually now have an index value that's out of bounds, but this index the CPU can't immediately figure out that this value is out of bounds. What we then do, it will utilize the prediction of the BPU and enter so-called transient execution, meaning that it will continue speculating as if it were actually in bounds, this index value. Of course, since the index isn't actually in the array 1, we will retrieve some other value, for instance, a secret, which then also gets cached. And of course, the dangerous thing is now the access to the second array, because now dependent on the secret value, we load a different cache line to the cache, and we can exfiltrate what the secret is by a simple cache covert channel. And this is, of course, a Spectre attack. Now, the Spectre attack has now been known for a while now, so of course, there have been a few mitigations. One of this mitigation is so-called speculative load hardening. It works by selectively poisoning the value returned by this first array access when you're within transient execution. More specifically, this works as follows now. If we have a value that's an index that's still inbounds, then exactly the same thing as before happens. We retrieve the array 1 value. We don't poison the value that we retrieve because we're not in transient execution. And then we retrieve the associate value from array 2. And of course, everything still gets cached. We can also train the BPU as before. Nothing changes here. All works exactly as before. And now it gets a bit different. When we now actually have an index that's no longer in the bounds, then of course, we still bypass the condition. Speculative load hardening does not prevent transient execution. This means we still use the BPU prediction, we enter transient execution, and we also load this temporary value from array 1. So the secret still gets cached. But now something special happens. Because we're now in transient execution for SSH, we now essentially redirect this loaded value to some mundane deterministic value. So this is what we call poisoning the value. Specifically, when we now access array 2, this value has been poisoned, so we're now actually just loading some other mundane cache line that's entirely deterministic, that does not depend on the secret. And this means we can also no longer use a cache covert channel to exfiltrate what the secret is. This is the speculative load hardening defense. And this is kind of where we started. But there are some limitations of SSH. The first limitation is that SSH, as the name might suggest, it only protects loads. This is its first goal. And also, it does not protect a value secrets that are already present in the register. In the previous gadgets, we had two arrays. The first array, kind of this array 1 already, we needed two loads. So we first loaded array 1, and then we loaded array 2. But if we don't need this load, if the value is already in a register value, SSH does not engage, and it's not protected. And kind of the starting point of this project was, well, what happens, for instance, with stores? We obviously have loads, but we also have stores. So how does SSH handle stores in general, maybe? And there's kind of a complication with stores. Meaning it was already previously observed that contrary to loads, transiently executed stores don't necessarily get cached in caches. So we can't directly use a cache covert channel to exfiltrate the information. But this started us thinking, well, we know that stores, of course, still use virtual addresses. So maybe the address translation process can be used to exfiltrate some information, also for transient instructions. And this is kind of our starting point. So maybe before I get into the direct details here, I want to give a quick recap on how address translation works. For this, let's just consider a virtual address. It's 64 bits wide, and we can decompose this virtual address into 3 segments. You have the lower 12 bits, which are the offset inside the page. Then we have the next bit 12 to 48, which is the so-called virtual page number. We also have some more significant bits after that, but they're not relevant for this current discussion. Now, if we want to translate this virtual address into a physical address, we take the virtual page number, and we first decompose into 4 sections. I should note, I'm assuming here that we have 4 levels of paging. Now, once you have decomposed it into 4 9-bit segments, the translation process proceeds as follows. We first use a special CR3 register, which gives us the so-called root page table, or in this case, the level 4 page table. And then we use the 9 most significant bits of the virtual page number to index this level 4 page table, which gives us the level 4 page table entry. And this level 4 page table entry again gives us the base physical address of the level 3 page table entry. Then we use the next 9 most significant bits from the virtual page number to index into this level 3 page table entry, which gives us the physical address of the level 2 page table, and so on and so forth, until we arrive at the level 1 page table entry, which is now the physical base address of the page in which the virtual address resides in. So combining it with the offset of the virtual address, we now have that actual physical address of this virtual address. Okay, but of course, well, maybe first of all, this entire process is called a page table walk. And well, a page table walk is expensive because we need to walk through all different levels of paging. So we want to cache the result in a special cache, namely the so-called translation local site buffer. And of course, before we initialize a new virtual address translation, we first check whether the address translation is already present in the TLB. If it is, then we bypass the page table walk. Now, I want to draw special attention here to the fact that all these page tables, they're just regular pages in memory. And also, in particular, these page table entries that we're accessing as the page table walk progresses are also just regular cache lines in memory. And this means that they can be cached. And in fact, when a page table walk progresses, they will be cached. And this gives us a way of monitoring how the page table walk progresses by simply checking which of these PTEs are cached. And this now allows us to conduct the following investigation. Here we're actually comparing 2 different CPUs. We're comparing Intel Skylake with AMD Vermeer. And we want to analyze speculative stores. We need some way to start speculative execution. And for this, we just use speculative RSB. It doesn't require training, so it immediately gives us a nice transient window. I want to point out here that the length of this transient window is simply determined by how long it takes to load the return stack, so we can tweak it by varying the length of this load. Now, we want to actually observe a page table walk. So to do this, we first need to flush the target, we need to invalidate the TLB of the target of our store here, and we need to actually flush all page table entries from the cache so that we can observe them being loaded by the page table walk. And now with that being done, let's just start a speculative store and see what happens. What we now observe, we observe that for both of these generations, a page table walk does apparently start because suddenly the page table entry is cached. We see on Intel Skylake that there's only 1 PT being cached, while in AMD Vermeer there are all 4 PTs are cached. This is important, but I get back to the fact. Let's for now just remember that the page table walk starts on both things. So speculative stores still starts page table walks. And now let's dig a bit deeper. Let's actually start changing the transient window by simply flushing address translations and invalidating now PTEs or caching or flushing the PTEs from the cache. We can now extend the length of the transient window because address translation, of course, also affects how long it takes to load the return stack. Let's start just increasing a transient window. What we observe by AMD Vermeer, not a lot starts happening, but for for Intel Skylake, more and more page table entries are starting to get cached. So we can now really see how the page table walk progresses. Okay, now we have extended the entire kind of reached the maximum transient window that we can achieve using this method. And now we see something else. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is that on AMD Vermeer, we see that the target actually is cached for a speculative store. Or in Intel Skylake, this does not happen. This is already interesting. We see that speculative stores can lead to caching of the target on newer CPU processors like AMD Vermeer, but in older ones on Intel Skylake, this is not the case. And the second observation, let's return to the fact that we saw in AMD Vermeer already by just the smallest transient window, we already see the entire page table walk completing. And then nothing else happens. And this indicates to us that the page table walk just isn't being aborted when a transient window closes. Kind of the CPU sends out the request to the page table walk, and when a transient window closes, this request just keeps on being processed. The address translation goes on to full completion, but but it doesn't stop. While in Intel Skylake, it always stops. And this is the second fact I want to see. The page table walk is abortable on only on Intel Skylake. And we can now analyze this in more detail on more CPU generations. And we see for Intel Sandy Bridge, Skylake, and Coffee Lake, we always see the target isn't cached, but the page table walk is abortable, and the page table walk always starts. There are newer Intel generations, actually the target is also cached, similar to how it is on AMD. And on AMD, Summit Ridge, and Vermeer, we observe that the page table walk is not interrupted, so it always progresses to completion, but the target is also cached and the page table walk always starts. Now, we analyze some further properties using this. Then we analyze fences as well. We put a fence before the speculative store. Here we see that L fences and M fences reliably prevent speculative address translation, but S fences, interestingly, do not. For S fences, speculative address translation does always occur. We also observe that stores to clean pages are not cached again. And stores to cache lines that are present on another core are actually always cached, even on these older generations where stores to other caches are usually not cached. And now we can use this information actually to build a covert channel that only uses transient stores. And I've only spoken about stores until this point, but you can of course also use another instruction that requires address translation. For instance, cache flushes. They also require address translations, and they also work for this covert channel just this way. In particular, we do not require that in any way the target is actually cached. We only require the address translation process, and our covert channel then achieves a transmission rate of 175 bits per second with an error rate of 3%. And now let's return to my starting point, namely speculative load hardening. We first verify that Spectre gadgets with loads are actually protected, as should be expected for SLH, of course. But now let's look at this following gadget that uses a store with a secret that's already in a register. This is not protected by SLH, and we see that, and we could also observe this, that here we can leak register values also actually on CPUs where the store isn't actually cached, because in this case we monitor the address translation process. But we see that there was a more enhanced SLH, the so-called ultimate SLH, that came about a few years ago, and it does mitigate this leak because it provides additional stronger protection guarantees. For this, let me come to my summary. We observe that speculative address translation occurs for most instructions and on most architectures. We see, though, that the extent of the page table walk that's kicked off by this kind of address translation of a speculative instruction differs greatly between the microarchitectures. We also determined and examined the implications of fences, page attributes, and coherency state. And we used all this information to then build a covert channel that only uses transient stores or flushes. And then we found that SLH leaks for transient stores to registers. And of course, further details you can find in the paper. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there any remaining questions?
Cool, thank you very much. Yeah, well, perfect.
So at one point, you mentioned that you flush the TLB, the target, the page table entry, but I think you also mentioned something like page walker cache or something like that, some extra special caches. How do you flush these? Which are
it's actually interesting. The inf LPG instruction actually flushes the page walker caches. That was actually something interesting that's actually stated in the Intel manual, and I was surprised that it does this automatically. Yes, that's how we just do it.
Excellent. One more? Yes? Cabes. Perfect. Oh my God. You need someone that is good at...
Thanks for the nice talk. So do you have any indications of how your new primitive would increase the set of gadgets that you can exploit in real software, for example, the Linux kernel or a browser or something?
We have not explored this avenue directly, but I think it would be interesting. How large exactly how many gadgets you could find using this. Yes.
Good. Ah, you're a troll.
On the slide you had with the diagrams of different amounts of flushing, on the AMD side, you clearly got into caching of the target. On the Intel side, looking at that diagram, how do you conclude that the target's not cached?
I admit it's not that clear here, but what we also did, what you can also do, you can ensure that the address translation completes immediately by not flushing your TLB, and then using a very long transient window, and then you can see that it does not get cached.
Yes.
Which is the way you can check that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we still have time for more questions. I can ask something. So I saw that you open source your code, and there's a lot of code. Is there a mechanism in which your code could be actively reused or expanded upon by the community so that, for example, if we wanted to compare or to measure what you're doing here for future microarchitectures, like, I don't know if people will be able to write another paper just reproducing the same work, but maybe for the community it will be nice to be able to see how the behaviors evolve over time. Have you thought about, like, I don't know, how does this look like beyond the paper?
You mean like the tests, essentially these tests that you use to examine how these different behaviors over the different processors?
Right.
That's actually, we do have the code directly for this paper, but in the future there might actually be another more rigorous framework that re-implements these tests, but in a slightly more user-friendly way, so that you can immediately run it on whichever architecture of your choice. So we might make that available soon. Yes.
Nice. Cool. Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, we thank our speaker one more time.